So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Anna Marie. Hi, Geoff. Good to be here with you. I thought I'll draw a parallel between government and boards and talk about the preparedness or unpreparedness of government in terms of the current pandemic and how hugely this has had an impact, a detrimental impact on health and the finances of the population and globally. And similarly, from a board composition point of view, the board is at the center of risk management, as you correctly put it. And in our time, so many company disasters have been put to the dysfunctional nature of a board. While at the same time, there's thousands of successes that can be also attributed to the great work of the board. And so having that balance is important. And the set of skills that is in the board is without a doubt the secret ingredient. And the level of independence that is required indeed is an answer to that ability to make the board functional and in total control or absolute, not in terms of the control of the organization and its path, to see the strategy and to have the right ingredients in terms of skills for the directors to guide the organization in that direction. So from a non-executive director, the importance of time available, because of the distance that there should be between the actual operations and the non-executive director, the time that is allocated by the person and the responsibility that comes with such an appointment needs to be taken into consideration right from the start. The science of recruitment for the diversity in the board is very definitely a primary action by the organization to enable a board to be effective. And as times change, to be flexible and agile enough to adapt the organization and its strategy through the right skill set within the board is critical to sustainability and to continuity, as has been illustrated in recent times by this incredible pandemic and its outcomes that we are suffering. So for me, the non-executive director is a key ingredient in the board composition, and one that has the time, the skills, and the independence to complement the decisions that are made by the board.
Thank you for that, Teresite. I appreciate that intro, Geoff. Welcome, thank you as well. You've got many board meetings around you right as we speak, and you just came out of one. So thank you for taking the time. Your views around board composition and the impact of that on a well-functioning board?
Thank you, Anna Marie, and thank you for my inclusion. Thanks to Teresite for her introduction. I fully agree with what's been said. And really, when one looks at a board, it really is back to basics. How's the board been inducted? Who are the people you're inducting? What are the different skills? And the skill sets will vary from company to company, depending on how you want to run. Leadership is also terribly, terribly important. Your chairperson, your relationship with the executive committee, and as Teresite has mentioned, not crossing that line between operational and strategic is terribly important. But what one finds is that just the simple things of regular communication, papers going out on time to the directors, application by the directors to those papers so that they are ready for their board meetings and that they have input, all those sort of things which are so basic are just important if you're going to have a well-functioning board. The ability of the chairperson to use the talent of all the people within that boardroom so that you get all the valued experience that the different people have had. It's often questioned as who should be in the boardroom. Obviously, there's certain parties that are always in the boardroom, your CEO, your CFO, and then there are so many other elements that you can talk about. You can talk about IT, you can talk about communications, marketing, and it will vary from company to company. Obviously, skills within the industry that you are involved in. But one of the biggest things for a director is, number one, to know what they've got to comply with in terms of what the Companies Act says, what the different legislation says. If you're in a state-owned enterprise, you need to be aware of the PFMA and other legislation that affects your industry. So you've got to have the background knowledge, you've got to have the company knowledge, and you've got to be able to apply yourself, speak at the right time, and give strategic direction to the company. There must also never be the fear of speaking up and being victimized, and that is the role of a competent chairperson to make sure that that always happens. But I cannot stress sufficiently the timeous flow of information to all directors, and that they are kept informed as they are agents of the company. And the other point that was also mentioned earlier is that the company in toto should know exactly who their board directors are, and the directors should have an appreciation not only of just the company, the executive, but also the staff that work within the organization, so that they are adequate ambassadors and not just figureheads. I think that one of the most important things, we're all being exposed at the moment to the COVID pandemic, which has had devastating effects, not only on South Africa and South African companies, big and small, but we're also being exposed to the weather patterns and the population of the earth. And the awareness of all these developing criteria and the risk factors that relate to our businesses are so important. And I think you as a director, not only have you got to be involved in the company and what the company does, but you've got to be aware of the environment, both within your country and around the world, of how that's going to affect you. You've got to be mindful when we talk about the integrated reporting and integrated thinking of the different elements of society. Should we call it the humans, the environment itself, and the profit factor? And you've got to take all those into account as you think and build a business. What was very heavily commented on in the webinar yesterday was the fact that if you've got employees and they can't get to work, problem. If you haven't got access to water and you need water, problem. And all those sort of things need to be considered in the risk factors of your business. So the risk profile of the company is terribly, terribly important. Another thing, just to go back on what was mentioned a little bit earlier, is the role of the board secretary. The board secretary has a tremendous responsibility insofar as the induction is concerned of directors, and keeping them up to date with all the latest developments. And the latest developments are not just what happens on the corporate front or on the King front. It's also about world events that affect the company. So I cannot stress how important the role of a board secretary is, that we remain within the tracks that we should be in, but also that our minds are expanded to think of the risks that we need to consider.
Thanks, Geoff. Teresita, your views, and I want to ask you to also specifically talk a little bit around diversity. I know you will, as well, the JSE last year came out with, having revisited the listing requirements, saying in the past we spoke about board diversity on race and gender, but guys, we want you to report on a broader spectrum of diversity. How does diversity impact the functioning of a board, and specifically composition then as well?
Very definitely, in terms of diversity, the field is well broadened. And in terms of skills, gender, And also in terms of the international scene, as Geoff was talking about, how we are at the moment dealing with the, let's call it the license to operate, as an example. It demands that there is absolute focus on not only the skill set, which now has to also include, I would say, entrepreneurship is a very important addition to the skill set that is required. In terms of women advancement, we see a significant drive and research that has proven exactly how the presence of women in leadership echelons has enabled better results and a lot more humanity and new solutions. So the diversity that is pledged is increasing in let's say in the way in which it translates to the very point that Geoff made earlier in terms of how we deal with the world changing, the planet and the climate change. All of that together calls for a rethink and a evolution of how the board is composed and how the board is trained. That point you made, Anna-Marie, in terms of yesterday's workshop is critical, that earlier in the formation of professionals and future directors, there is a good dose of directive, of development of what we used to call soft skills, for example. And as you mentioned recently, is now essential capabilities in a person. The leadership, the quality of the leadership and the chairmanship in itself, from a diversity point of view, dictates the progress, or at least the success of the board to compose itself in a way that is ready and able to deal with the problems ahead.
I think the biggest thing that one has to be is you need to be, that availability is terribly important. If you cannot give sufficient time to be at meetings on a regular basis, and another thing as we go along, I also want to mention is confidentiality within meetings, which to me is absolutely critical. And also the thought of yourself and your conflict of interest, to disclose that at all times. I think those things are terribly important. So you've got to be careful when you go on more than one board as to whether you are compromising yourself and whether you have, as is mentioned again and again, the time and the ability to apply yourself. What size should it be? Difficult to put it into numbers, but I would feel that when you get up to 10 members and start going over that level, and with everybody wanting to contribute, it makes board meetings rather difficult to handle. I wouldn't give a specific as to too big or too small, but I'd say up to 10 is good. Over 10 becomes a challenge. Well, I suppose the first thing I should say about risk is an everyday challenge and should be embraced by the organization and the people responsible in the organization for the different risks. It's not a once-a-year assessment, and the oversight should come from the board. So the presentation of the risk dynamics and what they should be formulated by the executive committee and approved by the audit committee, who should apply their mind to how risk is progressing. In exactly the same way that we talk about an integrated report not being a once-a-year exercise, we talk about it being an everyday experience. I feel exactly the same way about risk. And maybe at this stage, I should also bring up that one of the biggest things that face us today is that we have a variety of different types of companies. And in the state-owned enterprise space, one of the biggest things that is happening is, where does the board fit in? Does the board have the responsibility that it should have, and can it make the decisions that it needs to make? or is there outside interference? And that brings me back to, where does the board fit in? Who appoints the board? What is their responsibility? And do they execute on that responsibility? And coming back to risk, the risk of not being able to exercise your responsibility is an incredibly high risk. And that sits with all members, in my mind, who sit on state-owned enterprises.
I think on a number of levels, the concern is definitely something that needs to be addressed and needs to be investigated. And there, of course, there is levels of consultation, not only with the individual, but also in terms of where the discomfort has arisen from. Where is the source of the discomfort coming from? And there are a number of people, including the company secretary, that here is critically important, that is able to not only use methodology, but in fact offer from a base of knowledge and understanding, and including the law and including the protocols that apply. The ethics code, King is critical to that. There are so many ways in which one should apply a level of measure and performance review, but it cannot be ignored. Even if it is corridor talk, it is something that needs to be addressed and needs to be taken seriously from the word go.
I think if the documents are correctly prepared, and you've got summaries from management on detailed documents which can be read if the board member chooses to do so, that immediately shortens the amount of time somebody's got to spend, and they can apply their mind. They can make the decision as to whether they want to go into the long detail of a voluminous report or whether the executive summary is sufficient. And that comes down very, very clearly to the trust of one another. Another point that we haven't really raised today, which is terribly important, is reputation. The reputation of the company, the reputation of the directors is paramount. And, you know, we have a look, as you will say, at many of the failed organizations, and we'll see that there are some names who we would never in our wildest dreams have thought would be associated with those downfalls. But sitting on those boards with best intent, those people somehow became involved with the downfall of those companies. And I'm extremely mindful as an individual of the fact that wherever you sit, you're associated with, and therefore you've got to make sure at all times that your reputation, that you have regard to your reputation. I can't give you an answer of how you should act or what you should or shouldn't be doing. But one's got to be ever mindful of that, because if the right things don't happen, you've got a problem. And this overrunning of board meetings is a critical element which needs to be addressed. I do not think we need to have more board meetings. I think that where there's the necessity for more board meetings because the company dictates on certain matters that have got to be dealt with urgently, you have an extra board meeting. But to just elongate your board meetings because things are not efficiently handled is not the answer for me.
Teresite, Geoff, thank you so much. You gave me an immensely difficult task here. You have thrown so many gems into this conversation that I found it very hard to bring them all together. So, but I will try my best and not to repeat what you've said. I think in the beginning when Anna-Marie asked in terms of impact in the introduction, Teresite, you said in terms of the NED, the time, the independence and the skills in making decisions is extremely important. And what I heard from Geoff on that same question, kind of three things: getting back to basics, and then the social factors that impact and how we respond on them as a board. And I want to link that, Anna-Marie, to your conversation where you almost said that this sounds like a question that you shouldn't ask, and that is the job of the board rests on the shoulders of the people in there. What are they there to do? They are there to do what the board is required to be done. So in that sense, how they respond to that and with the mindsets and the worldviews that they bring to the table, it's extremely important. And also, you also referred to the chair and the responsibility of the chair, which I think is very important because it's in the chair's space to maximize the directional contributions of those sitting around the table. And not just to be decisive, but to be open-minded and courteous and allow people a voice, which links to the question that you asked Teresita asking in terms of the skills of the non-executive director, which is someone that needs to be independent, someone that understands there's a difference between my role as a manager from outside of the board where I may be and my role as a director in this organization, and I need a different set of skills here. I'm not here to manage, but I'm here to give oversight, to challenge constructively what is happening, and for that I need a space where I can voice, where I have psychological safety to speak my mind, and where the chair allows me and actually facilitates that kind of conversation. Then you spoke about the risks, and what I gathered from that is a risk is an enterprise-wide challenge, and the oversight is immense, and it's not just on the board side, but it's in that relationship between board and the executives, and one has to know the boundaries in that. But it's also important, if I understood you correctly, that each party understands not just the boundary, but that there's a lot of trust between both parties in managing that risk, which cannot just sit with one or the other. It is enterprise-wide, and it should be carried in that responsibility enterprise-wide. From the flow of information, what I gathered from that is the quality of information that you emphasized, Teresita, because that, you say, mitigates a lot of what's happening. And the time, in terms of how many times we have to come together as a board, there is a kind of a regular rhythm of the company. And then you indicated that there could be challenging times, like in times of acquisition, etc., that demands a different rhythm in the company. But in all of this, the flow of the information, the quality, and then especially the point that one of you made, I'm not entirely sure who, the cohesion of flow of information between different board meetings. If that is well controlled and well managed, then it also helps in terms of the number of boards that you need, because you can deal with it diligently based on accurate information, based on the trust of those that have supplied the information. But that's the best I can do in summarizing what you have said. I know it doesn't do you justice at all, but we will have to listen to the whole recording to really make sense of that. But thank you so much, much appreciated. Thank you, Anna Marie.